Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called American Animals. So, this ultimately is a film that at the end of the day is a heist movie. When watching this, it's a movie that ultimately says it's based off a true story, but also that it says it is a true story. So, when watching this movie, I really like the fact that when going into this movie, we have it to where there's even the actual people that are kind of very much going in from time to time to ultimately help the story along or to ultimately give them their exact perspective of a lot of things. I really thought it was interesting when going into this movie how we even had like I think that this movie was for the most part it was shot like really in a amount of different ways, and I wish I could say more positive things about just really the visuals or whatever how this movie was presented, because it kind of feels unique in a lot of ways to ultimately have the actual person ultimately talking to the actor person ultimately mentioning it's like, well, hey, is this exactly how it went? And ultimately the real person was like, yeah, I think so, I guess from his perspective. The thing of it is, it seems that we have a jumbled mess of a lot of times where ultimately a lot of different people are seemingly telling one story, and it seems like there is a mixture of a different bunch of people that are all saying it's like, well, maybe from his perspective, this is the way the story went down, but this is my perspective, kind of, and like it all kind of eventually gets jumbled eventually, and it seems like the story could ultimately be told from a different point of view or in different ways and stuff like that. There's some people that might not want to disclose anything or whatever, but going into this movie, I thought that it was really interesting just because when really looking at it, it was a movie where I would say like you had it to where common people were so desperate to try to get out of their the life that they lived, that they are so desperate to try and justify this heist that ultimately they are pushing themselves to the brink of just going like, god, I would just want one thing to completely turn my life around. And ultimately, they are assuming that this heist is going to be that one thing. And we have it to where it's a bunch of college kids that are otherwise justifying that, well, they should probably easily be able to get away with this heist. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, you know what? Like, I don't quite understand when honestly looking at it. It's like, why steal what they end up stealing? Like when and all justifyingly so it's like you should be stealing something that actually is reasonably like a thing that you could easily steal, like money or gold or something like that, where you can exchange it easily and get money for it, or even have stolen money. And wouldn't that have been better off than trying to steal books and or expensive painting ash like things that eventually you're going to have to find somebody somehow with your common knowledge to be able to exchange these paintings and or books or whatever. When going into it, I'm like, you have to be able to really have already been in this business for a long time to do this kind of stuff. It's not an easy thing for common people to be able to just, oh yeah, I'm just gonna black market sell some stuff, some paintings and whatever. And I think reasonably, I think that's when they should have gone to more common crimes or whatever and work their way up. Stealing money would probably have been a better thing to do than stealing a painting or something like that. Like if you stole a painting, like the evidence of you having that is right then and there. We're ultimately looking at it. for someone to steal a thing of money, like how would they be able to figure that out unless they had tracking numbers and all the money? It's a little bit harder that way. But anyways, what am I saying? As if I'm some expertise on heist and whatever. Uh, but I just thought that this movie is really interesting. Just the overall approach of somebody just otherwise just like consistently going at this, and every we have it to where all these four people are justifiably going in here and otherwise just going like, yeah, this sounds like a sound thing to be able to steal. Yeah. Plus, we have it from a lot of people's perspectives as well. That maybe there wasn't an actual person to be able to have said had person talk to get all this information from. So when really looking at it, there are some times in this story where you just have to take people's word for it, or there are a lot of times that you would just have to go like, well, maybe somebody made this up for the story, so that way to justify that when looking at it, it's seems like a legitimate thing this whole entire time, but really when looking at it, it's probably just people that desperately just wanted to steal something just to feel better about their lives, I guess, was really the real true attempt at this. I don't know. I'm not sure. I could be completely wrong. Um, I just feel like reasonably also that theft eventually kind of wore down on them, kind of messed with their minds a little bit, and then ultimately made them even want to attempt after that riskier things because they had already stolen expensive items, and so why not go further into just trying to go like, oh, okay, well, I stole this item and it did nothing for me, so now I need to just try and just otherwise just get further on into just basically a meltdown just because ultimately what else could I get away with kind of thing. So going on into this movie, I thought it was interesting. I thought again, like the visually way it was shot was kind of interesting. I think the approach of this movie was kind of fascinating to ultimately see like a narration of the real person talking throughout this movie. When looking at it, also very much the characters had been familiar to me. The guy who played Spencer, I had seen him recently again in the movie Mammals, and ultimately I was like, this guy must like the word have the word like animals or mammals or whatever kind of like bizarrely in his titles of his movies. So I guess for him, like this just worked. Uh, we have it to where Warren ultimately is Evan Peters, who ultimately has been Quicksilver in the X-Men films and ultimately tied to American Horror Story and stuff like that, which I was kind of thought it was like, man, this is kind of fascinating to have him be in here, as well as some of these other actors and stuff like that, just being and doing this kind of movie. So let's ultimately go into the double five time to ultimately just talk about this film. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was kind of like a very different approach to a based on true life story about guys who ended up stealing things that were very common esh like people. It kind of is an interesting thing when you have it to where because normally every single heist movie or whatever would always be this kind of shred of something that you couldn't believe just because reasonably it's very much a uncommon like you have it to where these people have been skilled for years and are approaching this and are easily be able to knock anybody over with doing some crime or anything like that. But now we just have regular people that are just so desperate to otherwise just realize that that effort, like this thing is so like high in value, and let's figure out a way to get it and steal it. So let's go into the spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, yeah. In the very beginning of this movie, we ultimately have a artist called Spencer who is drawing his own self portrait and then tearing the self portrait. Like we have it to where Spencer is just kind of, I think, really just in a word, spent. We have it to where this character is just kind of going through the motions of life, and reasonably, it's like we mentioned, where Spencer ultimately tells us, the real Spencer actually tells us that ultimately it seems that a lot of artists, when you kind of hear about any number of their backstories, have heard that they've been haunted through most of their lives, very much plagued by things here and that. Like looking at any high end artist or whatever. So we end up having Spencer ending up going to this very high end library that has some very expensive art, ultimately showcasing uh, any number of really high end books and stuff along those lines. We ultimately have it to where seemingly there is one book that ultimately has a flamingo on it that ultimately is worth seemingly $9 or $12 million or something along those lines. We ultimately have it to where it seems like there are high end books in this portion of the library that seem to be sealed off and ultimately seem to be having a lot of book glass covering of these books to ultimately not just anybody could just grab them and just take them with them. So we end up having Spencer looking at this book, and ultimately he is admittedly talking to his friend Warren about this book and talking about it over and over and over and over again. We have it to where Warren bizarrely has some weird ass tattoo of a dinosaur and a ceiling fan on his arm, which ultimately is okay. Like anybody could have any kind of approach of tattoo and whatever and what have you. But I just kind of was like okay, so Warren is just a character that is just kind of very free or very much just uh, I think waiting around to see, like, ultimately we have it to where Warren is kind of living his life, but also when looking at it, we have it to where like Warren also needs like that kind of moment that Spencer talks about of being like okay, like we need our lives to go somewhere. We need our lives to just get to a certain um, turnaround point. Because we ultimately have it to where Spencer is ultimately mentioning that he wanted one part of his life to all of a sudden just completely change everything for him, and that hasn't happened yet. And so we end up having it to where the more and more that Spencer is talking about this, the more that Warren is concocting this plan. We ultimately have it to where the real Warren is ultimately mentioning that, like, well, there wasn't a real ringleader of this whole thing. So I guess he had to forcibly become a ringleader because there wasn't actually one. Ultimately, at some point, having Warren going into the back of um, this meat place and end up stealing all this meat, and we end up having the butcher running after them, and because ultimately they were to ultimately just throw all this stuff away, but we have it to where Warren ends up stealing all of it and running off with it, and eventually Spencer ends up dropping some of it, and they end up just kind of the butcher ends up chasing after them, but ultimately they end up getting away. Ultimately showing like little thefts here and there that ultimately they have done already. So we end up pushing on. So ultimately, we end up we have to where Spencer consistently goes into there to keep like going into and finding out all the blueprints to this entire area. We have it to where seemingly that Spencer is going to draw out exactly how everything looks on the inside, basically blueprinting the whole entire building. So ultimately, they can figure out how exactly to be able to steal things. Ultimately, we have it to where seemingly they are going to try to otherwise steal things at night. But then ultimately, we have it to where Eric comes in and ultimately basically realizes that no, you'd be better off to try and steal things during the day. So we end up having it to where the reason why that they need Eric is to ultimately have a guy that is good with numbers or good with uh, is an intelligent person. And so when looking at this, we have it to where Eric is kind of the numbers guy to ultimately justify like having a higher range of knowledge of being able to do this heist. We have it to where Eric can make the consensus about whatever is to all go on. We ultimately have it to where reasonably we have Warren and Spencer eventually hiring Chaz because ultimately he is the wheelman. The big problem that I think I have with this actual heist is the overall just like, okay, why did they have three people? Why did they have four people? Like the fourth person is the wheelman, but like I'm just not quite understanding like what did the other three people have to do? Like I didn't understand why like Spencer ultimately like becomes the lookout man when they actually put together this actual crime. And when looking at it, also, like, I didn't quite understand why they went into makeup before, but then the second time around, they went without makeup. I just thought it was goofy. Anyways, so we go into here, and so we have it to where they end up plotting and figuring out and wanting to go during the day. And so ultimately, what ends up happening is we have it to where the guys otherwise go in and they had all done their exams, and so ultimately we have it to where Warren ends up going and noticing that it seems that this librarian that is by the expensive artifacts ultimately has other people around her. And so ultimately we have it to where all the old men, all the guys otherwise disguise themselves as old men to go into this library and are now just kind of walking around. And we ultimately have it to where Warren is telling them all to abort because there's too many people surrounding this one woman and there's too many eyewitnesses. So we end up having them otherwise decide to just go like, well, like, I guess this isn't the perfect time. We end up finding out that ultimately Warren is to call and ultimately go and find out when is a better day to ultimately reschedule um, to get them to go and do this heist again. So we also have it to where supposedly Warren was to go to Amsterdam to try and figure out uh, how they can ultimately exchange this expensive high end item for money, of course. So it seems that Warren had gone through the trouble of going to Amsterdam, supposedly, and gotten some old man to tell him this information. Bizarrely, I don't know why. Um, and we are ultimately ending up supposedly to believe that like I think that these guys otherwise aren't exactly like it seems like they could go either way about this whole crime thing. When looking at it, it seems like a lot of the people could otherwise just go like, nah, like, well, if anything, we tried this and it didn't work out, so like, how about we just scrap the whole thing and just like at least we don't get arrested for anything by doing any of this. So because we have it to where quasi, I think Spencer ultimately is kind of relieved about the fact that they didn't actually go with it, go and do this, and but ultimately they're like, I think a lot of them are like, well, are we actually going to actually still do this at some point? So we end up having it to where reasonably they end up like, dude, the thing is on, like we're gonna do this again. The only thing is, instead of them actually going in disguise, they are otherwise just gonna go as just themselves, which I thought was stupid. I'm like, wait a minute, so you guys went in there as disguised before, but now, like, because they said that, it's like, well, no, we won't go in there as a disguise because otherwise it stands out too much. So I'm like, well, when looking at it, I'm like, we have it to where, like, when going in there, they're going to be identified easily, but I guess whichever. Anyways, so going into here, so we end up having it to where this time around they're actually planning on doing the otherwise crime. We ultimately have it to where ultimately the guys are otherwise going to taser the one woman and ultimately tie her up. And then ultimately they are going to try and steal whatever they can. And we end up having it to where Spencer is ultimately outside as a lookout. Chaz is otherwise the wheelman. And so we have it to where Eric and Warren ultimately go in and try and steal as much stuff as they possibly can. We end up having it to where Warren was supposed to take out the woman, and ultimately we end up having it to where Warren ends up calling Eric in and saying, "Hey, yeah, like I'm sure you'll be able to, uh, like I'll call you and tell you when I had taken care of the woman." Well, Warren didn't take care of the woman, so we end up having it to where ultimately, so Warren and Eric are now in there, and then ultimately we have it to where Warren eventually is to take care of the woman, ultimately ending up tying her up and all kinds of things. So eventually they end up stealing two books, and they end up trying to steal the flamingo thing. So they end up going through stealing these items with an elevator. The only problem is that they end up hitting one button wrong on the elevator, and so they end up just deciding, well, we're just gonna run out the door with these items. We're just gonna run out the door basically uh, with this flamingo book. So they end up kind of going as quickly as possible down these stairs, and they end up dropping the flamingo book, and then they end up just going like, well, F it, like let's just run. So we end up having it to where the two guys end up running without the book. It's obvious that they don't have the book. And so we end up having Chaz going like, "Hey, where's the book?" And ultimately they're like, "Yeah, we don't have it." So we end up having it to where seemingly these guys have done and had bupkissed nothing for yet again, but we have it to where ultimately Warren asks like, "Hey, like you stole a book, right?" to Eric. And so we have it to where it's seemingly that the books that both of them have are very high end books, and ultimately, I guess that's kind of the consolation prize for these guys to otherwise try to sell these books. So we end up having it to where Spencer and Warren ends up taking both of these books to try and see what their value is, and ultimately that is to ultimately showcase that, like, well, hey, like they're not going to get the big $12 million payout, but they're going to be able to get some other consolation prize for ultimately doing this heist. So we end up having it to where reasonably that ultimately it gets on the news that ultimately somebody had tried to steal all this stuff. Ultimately it seems that there is the van of which that they had left, and so on and so forth with this crime. And so ultimately, we have it to where the guys are otherwise saying like, how is it that they know that there was four guys doing this crime and so on and so forth? It seems like the van had gotten into an accident while they were trying to escape, and so on and so forth. Ba 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 ba. There were so many mistakes done with this crime. We end up having Warren just uh, hurling uh, onto the front of the car, or or we have it to where Warren ends up trying to get into the car, and ultimately ends up getting run over by the car. And then we have it to where Warren ends up going and like barfing into the car, which was great. It's a great part of the movie. Moving on. So we end up having it to where these guys end up going and trying to seemingly try to get money for these books, but when really looking at it, it seems that ultimately they had given them the wrong information. Spencer had given the curators, or the people, had given him his cell phone number, which is the wrong number to give. He should have given them uh, the hotel number. So we ultimately have it to where Chaz is ultimately losing his stuff right now, because ultimately he's like, dude, you have just killed all of us. You have just put a bullet in our heads. You have just sent us to prison forever by putting that little thing of information. Because we're going to have it to where there's no way that these guys are going to be able to sell these books. And so ultimately, it's just a moot point to eventually someone is going to figure out and find these guys, and it's just going to be a matter of time. Well, we end up having it to where they don't exactly sell these books, and we have it to where ultimately these guys are wearing, or just kind of, really kind of very much at a meltdown point, pretty much every single one of them. Because when looking at it, they didn't get any money from this crime that they stole these big expensive items from, and there's nowhere to really go with them. And so ultimately, we have it to where Warren ends up going and trying to steal a hungry man from a grocery store. We end up having Chaz basically rowing in his rowing machine, and that's all that he really does. We end up having it to where Eric ends up getting in a fight with somebody at a party, and we end up having Spencer ending up calling Warren, thinking at any moment that they are gonna figure out them, that they're gonna be able to figure out it was them that stole it and whatever. And we have it to where Warren is just like, relax. So we end up finding out that eventually that the cops had went after and sought after these four men and ultimately arrested all of them. And we have it to where ultimately every single one of these guys had went away for prison for 7 years, supposedly. We end up finding out that ultimately where all they had gone to eventually, it seemed uh, that Warren had been eventually a filmmaker. He went back to school and tried to be a filmmaker. Chaz had ultimately been a personal trainer. Spencer had been an artist. And ultimately, Eric had ultimately been. I don't remember. I don't remember what happened to him. He was a writer, and ultimately he had made this story, I guess, for this movie, I would assess. So, reasonably, it's kind of interesting to see every single one of the perspectives of all these people, because ultimately they narrated this the entire time. We end up having the real Eric ultimately coming on here and mentioning what actually happened. We have the real Chaz coming on here and mentioning what actually happened. We ultimately have the real Spencer coming on here and Warren coming on here and so on and so forth. But we all get to find out what ended up happening with all these guys. So, justifiably, I thought that was very much an interesting part of this movie. Um, we ultimately have it to where reasonably that they never really made any real money from any of this, from any of this stealing or whatever. Plus, it seems that there's a lot of times where people didn't quite understand whether or not stories were true or not. really there was some stuff where ultimately people could not really rely on Warren's story about whether he was saying the thing about Amsterdam or not. Or ultimately he really did go or if he didn't. We ultimately have it to a reasonably. It seems that there was a lot of times where ultimately people weren't exactly sure about the accuracy from anybody's story. Consistently, it was like, well, this is so and so's person's perspective, so ultimately that has to be the right perspective. A lot of times, there was a lot of unsureness, and so that's the thing that I kind of liked about this movie was basically like they could have done a couple scenes different and whatever and what have you, and to change this movie. But I think reasonably, like, I think a lot of these guys just justifiably wanted to probably just do this crime just to be able to say that they did it. Who knows? Maybe they were eventually going like, well, if we weren't to get money out of this product, then ultimately maybe we could write a movie for later on in life, and so on and so forth. So eventually we could get our story out there. Uh, Plus, I think a lot of maybe just creativity eventually just it boiled down into just like, well, hey, we could be really creative after this and just use this kind of in some ways of approaching this story and stuff along those lines. But anyways, yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, but at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say about this film. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.